There are many ways that we find to exclude and belittle each other, to teach other people that they are less than human. We do so on the basis of language, of race, of religion, of skin color, culture, of people's ableness or disability. And we enact those prejudices through the way we treat them. As a lawyer, I know what to do about the enactment of prejudice. There are good laws, there are good institutions to fight it. And as a lawyer in the 1980s, I fought against the enactment of the most profound form of racial prejudice that legal history has known, which was the apartheid system under which I grew up and from which I, as a young white person, benefited. But I want to talk today about something less tangible, something more interior. And let me start by using an example that's painful to myself. I grew up into sexual consciousness in South Africa, which was viciously homophobic. Like the rest of my beautiful continent, Africa, today still is. 34 countries in Africa still persecute, isolate, segregate, torture, jail, assault, and sometimes murder LGBTI people. Eventually, I threw off the sense of shame that I felt as an adolescent at being gay. As a young man in apartheid South Africa, working against apartheid's effects in the last decade of apartheid, I came out as proudly gay. And then President Mandela appointed me a judge as an openly and proudly gay man under the first constitution in the world that expressly and emphatically included protection against discrimination on the ground of sexual orientation. And here's the painful part. I've held high office. I have a loving partner who cares for me and is committed to me as I'm committed to him. And yet, somewhere deep inside, there's a little voice that whispers to me, is it really normal? Is it really normal? What is happening in the rest of Africa tells us that the governments, the people, some of the preachers of Africa still condemn us as abnormal, as immoral, as unbiblical, as not natural. And what I talk about is the way that those external actions, that enacted discrimination, finds a counterpart inside. We can call that the internalization of stigma, the internalization of shame. I experienced a second form, more difficult to talk about even. After coming out as gay in the 1980s, I became infected with HIV. I was diagnosed at the height of my legal practice, an exciting, difficult time. I was 32 years old, and I knew it was a death sentence. I would never see justice in South Africa. I would never see non-racialism or Nelson Mandela released from prison because I was certain to die. But worse than the sense of the death sentence of HIV was my sense of shame. I felt contaminated, I felt impure, I felt polluted. I felt that I had brought this upon myself, and worse, that I deserved it. When I started working with people very different from myself, black women, the spouses of mine workers, I discovered that they themselves too, even though they were so different from me in the specificities of our human condition, they felt that same shame. That same shame still keeps the epidemic of HIV on our beautiful continent, where 20, 30, maybe 40 million people. In my country, 13%, 7.5 million people are living with HIV and AIDS. That sense of shame still keeps this an epidemic of muteness, an epidemic of silence. Part of the reason is the enactment of discrimination, especially against women who are diagnosed at antenatal clinics, women who take the diagnosis back to the partner who probably infected them, and who then feel the brunt of blame, discrimination, and often violence. So the enactment of discrimination is all too real. But inside, there's a part of us that tells too many of us with HIV, too many of us in our families, and there's hardly a family south of Sudan, in Central and Southern Africa, that is not affected. There's a part within that says, you deserve this. You brought it on yourself. You shouldn't have had sex. Yet no one who seeks comfort and conjunction in an adult, consensual, respectful relationship seeks harm through it, seeks ill from it. No one deserves it. All of this I know. I fell severely ill with AIDS 3 years after President Mandela appointed me as a judge, but I had the privilege of buying my life back with the salary of a judge. I've been on antiretrovirals for 22 years. I know and understand that this is just a tiny viral particle in my blood that is totally suppressed. It's hidden away. It's taken refuge in tiny reservoirs. I know. But this is not a condemnation, and yet I know that that voice inside myself and inside millions of people in Africa are still hearing the inner condemnation. We can call that the internalization of shame about HIV. There are other ways in which shame is internalized. It's happened on our continent. White people like me came to Africa, enslaved its people, took its resources, shipped them away, subordinated them. In South Africa, they set up the most systematic form of discrimination that legal systems have known. So systematic and so degrading was it that in 1973, rightly under international law, apartheid was recognized as a crime against humanity. I have no title as a bearer of white privilege. I have no title as a white person to speak about the internalization of 350 years of racial subordination in my country. But listen to Steve Biko. Steve Biko recognized that internal dimension. He said, the most powerful instrument in the hand of the white oppressor is the mind of the black person. He said more. He said white people must be made to realize that they are not superior, and black people must be made to realize that they are not inferior. He was talking about the internalization of racial shame. My friend Nini Molefe published a book last year. She calls it internal oppression. She speaks as a woman, she speaks as a black woman on 2 counts. She knows that inside there are voices that are telling her that she is less than human, worth less. Now, Steve Biko, his words and his life offer us a constructive solution to this. He was proudly black. He spoke out against the degradation of apartheid. His blackness was such a source of pride to him that 42 years and 2 months ago, the apartheid police beat him to death in September 1977. But his voice resonates all these decades later. Steve Biko proudly asserted himself in the pride of his blackness and of his beauty as a human being. The same has happened in the LGBTI community. In the last decades, we have celebrated the fact that throughout human history, a small part of us, maybe 5%, maybe 10%, in Congo, West Africa, East Africa, North Africa, throughout human history, a small percentage of us has always been queer, gender diverse, different. It's as natural as being left-handed. We have asserted with pride our humanness, our naturalness, our beauty, our contribution to human civilization. With HIV as well, in Botswana, some activists started a beautiful Miss HIV pageant where they invited young women living with HIV to participate for their loveliness and their beauty, asserting the fact that despite the stigma, despite the internalization of the stigma, they had beauty as human beings, that they could cast off the yoke of enacted discrimination, cast off, and this is my point, the yoke of internalized discrimination. So Steve Biko tells us what we can do about this inner dimension, this inner part of us that is an ally in the enactment of discrimination from the outside. He says to us first, recognize it. Recognize that there's a part of you that disables you, that silences you, that tells you that you are less than other people, less than human. Recognize it, talk about it, and most importantly, as his life shows, fight against it. That offers us the solution. Whether we are gay or straight, whether we are living with HIV or not, whether we are black or white, to recognize that the external enactment of discrimination also finds a place deep within, that the injury of external subordination and ostracism has a resonance inside. Once we recognize that, we confer greater power on ourselves as humans. We confer upon ourselves the power to assert ourselves in all our human fullness and loveliness. Thank you.